So without further ado, we could get started. And thank you, Sophia, for that invitation to delve into the course and online teaching. I've got a lot out of the EdTech website so far myself. So Sophia, you won't be surprised to know that when I was putting together the course, I was looking at the EdTech website quite a bit. There's a lot of different resources there. And standing by is Danny, who is going to speak later on, maybe in 30 or 40 minutes.
Okay.
And you can get these slides here, ebden.com/tips. Sometimes there's hyperlinks in the slides, so you can always go down that rabbit hole if you need a break from the top. And do email me with any questions. I've taught for 3 years in Department of Statistics and here in Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering. And then I came back to U of T this year to handle one course, Probability and Statistics. Previously, I taught it in 2018, or at least the last 5 or 6 weeks, but this was the first time I taught it from start to finish, the first time I coordinated the course, and first time I've done online teaching as well. And I enjoyed that online teaching a lot, and it opened my eyes to the hidden value in online learning. Yes, online teaching is a hurdle. And this is a cartoon from the Toronto Star a month ago, but it's a manageable one, sometimes even a desirable one. U of T is returning to in-person teaching this fall, and at the same time, online learning is not really a fad, is it? I don't need to persuade you of that because you found your way to this talk, where we're going to talk about tips on online learning in 4 parts. So I've got 18 tips. Well, Danny and I between us have 18 tips, and I've chopped them into 4 groups. Feel free to interrupt me at any time when we go through these. And you can also put things in the chat if you want, but because we're a small group, just feel free to unmute yourself and speak. So also there'll be places here and here. So after parts 2 and 4, where you can try out a breakout room to discuss with other people your reactions. And it's great, I see everybody's got their video camera on, so that's especially important for the breakout rooms. But let's get started with number 1 though, course setup. Each of these numbers breaks down into different letters. So number 1, the first one is letter A. So the first tip on setting up a course for online learning is to listen. And this slide is set up like pretty much all my slides are set up. In red italics underneath, you've got the why of that tip. So in this case, it's nice to listen to colleagues because we can avoid reinventing the wheel. And I mentioned my enthusiasm for the EdTech office, which was my rock in setting up this course. I also checked out a very useful lunch and learn from electrical and computer engineering. And if you click any of these blue links, you'll be taken to those web resources. Remember, here's the URL at the bottom where you can get these slides, and then you can get the links. There was a neat talk here from a colleague in statistical sciences, which reminds me that if you're thinking about setting up online learning, you can check within your field, what are the existing resources out there. Maybe in a search engine, you could type your subdiscipline of engineering and then online learning. And in my case, I got a lot out of this webinar in June. It was a good networking opportunity, keeping in touch with people that you meet in the webinar afterwards and bouncing around ideas on what's working and what's not working in online teaching. And of course, speaking with TAs is always helpful because they've got past experience of online learning and they can tell you what worked well for them, or what they liked, what they didn't, and so on. So this first tip is to listen. And then once you've created your syllabus for your course, the second tip is to listen some more. So in the first lecture, you could go over the syllabus document and just that. You don't need to get into technical content. To get some very nice feedback from students. I was impressed by the feedback that students gave on the syllabus in this course. And it may seem like a lot of time, 50 minutes to devote to a syllabus, but I think it is a good investment of the time. Feel free to borrow this kind of slide here to put people into breakout rooms. Remember, I'm coming to breakout rooms later on to guide that discussion so students can talk amongst each other about the syllabus. And then if you want, you can allocate, you can ask them to allocate a scribe who then reports back. And then there'll be this sort of frenzy of activity in the chat box, which you can save for later reading of all of the suggestions for the syllabus. Assigning roles in a breakout room is nice because it gives students a sense of responsibility for their learning generally. It's a double-edged sword though, and breakout rooms, some students have a negative experience of breakout rooms. The quality of the breakout room is only as good as, I mean what students put into it. So some people, if they think, oh, this is an activity with scribes, they might sort of go off to take a break and then come back to try to harvest the nuggets, right? So it can be an excuse to disengage when you create special roles like scribe. So it's a double-edged sword. Anyway, so the breakout rooms were one change to make for online learning. In the first lecture, I was struck by how many ways I had to change my first lecture for online learning. For example, even the land acknowledgement, because we were spread out all around the planet, that was an opportunity to talk about the UN DRIP, right? The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because quite a lot of us, maybe even most of us, weren't sitting on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Huron-Wendat and Mississaugas of the Credit. So lots of changes to consider for the first lecture of your online learning course. And speaking of geography, we ran a geography poll, so that started before the first lecture and then ran roughly the first week of the course. And the idea was to help schedule things throughout the term. So if you had to suddenly create a new time zone accommodated assessment date, or if you were had to move an entire assessment around, then having at a glance this kind of data at the bottom can guide you. So we had 127 people, at least 127, because I've only got data for about 70% of the class. So 127 were in this time zone here in Toronto, and you can see at a glance where the others are spread out. And it's also nice because it holds up a mirror to the class, so students can see where do they fit in the planet, in this somewhat detached experience of online learning. So speaking of our geographic diversity, you can add the local time in Quercus. This is a trick. If you're interested in it, the instructions are here at the bottom. If you click, it takes 5 or 10 minutes to set it up for the first time, a clock. I chose to put the clock on the landing page for the course, which was the syllabus page, so you can see the time and date here. So the new thing here is the gray box. Everything else there is a sort of familiar Canvas setup. And that's useful for the first week or two of classes if a student is in a different time zone and they're still getting their head around what's the Toronto time difference. It's particularly useful around daylight savings because, as you know, countries around the world change their clocks at different times of the year. I mean, yes, for us it's March and November, but it's going to be different all around. So you get these multiple transitions throughout the academic year, right? Okay, so any questions on setting up the clock or handling sort of geographic diversity when setting up the course? Okay. And I see a point in the chat about breakout rooms, and I'm going to come back to breakout rooms in a moment. That's a good point. So the 5th tip for setting up the course is to pay attention to your structure in Canvas to make sure your expectations are as clear as possible. So for example, on that previous slide, I listed 4 things. The first bullet point was an assessments page, right? So I had a one-stop shop for all the information about the assessments, how much are they each worth, and so on. And it doesn't all fit on this slide, but if you were to scroll down, you get sort of one section per assessment coming up, following a introductory section. For example, what does it mean to be an open book assessment in this course, right? And that's going to vary from course to course, so you can set your expectations in a one-stop shop here in Quercus. So that's the first of the 4 bullet points. The second one was about lectures. You can set up a table with all the recordings of your lectures in the first column. So those are hyperlinks to the recordings. And you can have a preamble which gives the Zoom link so people always know where the Zoom link is. And maybe explain what your legend is for the table that's coming up. So for example, in these lectures, they were given an alphanumeric code. The number was what week are they in from 1 to 13. A meant it was the first lecture that week. So for this course, we had synchronous lectures on Mondays. And then B, C, D, and so on were the asynchronous lectures on other days of the week, right? And then we start a new week here. And you can have a column for the textbook sections, which is hard to predict ahead of time, especially if you're doing a course for the first time. So you can keep this sort of fluid. You don't have to have it all laid out all the 13 weeks, but you can use this column to give sort of guidance about roughly what's coming up week by week. And then as you get closer to the week itself, you can refine it more. And this last column here is good for hyperlinks to things that would be useful. For example, the slide deck for that week. There's a link you could put. But my next tip regards this kind of link here, which is links to videos that I didn't produce, but the publisher did. So we used Pearson's book, Probability and Statistics for Scientists and Engineers. And thankfully, Pearson had produced 24 videos to accompany this course. And I didn't just dump them all on the students, but per week, you can recommend certain videos. Some of them I never recommended, like what is an average, but things like what does a p-value mean? You know, that's more, I think that's more useful for this course. And you can either replace some of your asynchronous material with that, sort of, put your feet up for a particular topic, or you can use it to augment. Depends on the quality of the videos your publisher is producing. So yeah, I was really grateful to Pearson for doing that in advance. The fact that I was using this solid textbook in its 9th edition now, accompanied by the publisher's online videos, gave me the confidence to say to the class on day one that attending lectures was optional. And this was generally well received. I haven't put in red italics underneath the why of this tip because this is the why here. It's these are 3 example comments from the course evaluations that were run in April. So these are students in their own words saying why they appreciated this sort of backwards approach of centering everything on the textbook, so that we're taking advantage of the fact in online learning that lectures are being recorded. So you can give students a break. I mean, somebody reported they kept them from burning out. You can allow the students to read the textbook and consult individual lectures as needed, rather than the other way around. So I won't argue that this tip is the future of teaching or anything. We all know that there's no substitute for an experienced instructor delivering quality lectures. There are problems with centering a course on a textbook. For example, over-reliance on a textbook can mislead students into seeing learning as an accumulation of correct answers. However, when you find yourself teaching a course for the first time, or let alone in a new paradigm like online teaching, pointing students to a solid textbook, not just any textbook, it has to be a good one, can be an effective form of damage control as you're doing that transition. Textbooks, in the case of online learning, textbooks are immune to problems of time zone differences, of audio quality, and paradoxically shifting the emphasis for the lectures to the textbook can increase the class engagement in some ways. And that class engagement is a major theme of this talk. There are 8 tips here under class engagement. And then topics 3 and 4 are smaller topics with just a couple tips per part. Okay, so we'll get into some class engagement tips. The first is, I mean, you're probably using some sort of discussion forum for the course. We use Piazza in this particular case. And this is something that most of us were doing before online teaching, but it's become more important since online teaching has taken off. So here's an example of a screenshot from Piazza. You cannot see up here is a student asking a question. What I've shown instead is the student's answer here to that question. And this is the instructor view of all that's going on. And as the instructor, you have this option to click a good answer. So I do recommend clicking that whenever the answer is correct or helpful. This encourages students to keep answering questions and increases readers' confidence that they can trust each other to explore the subject for themselves. The next tip is also about discussion forums. and this depends on which form software you're using, but you often get certain summary statistics, right? So here's an example from Piazza. This is a chart of the top student answerers based on, I mean, the top one gave 18 answers on Piazza over the course. So that, what I've often done in the past, I didn't do it this year for ECE 286 goal, is to tell the students on the first day, if you want a reference letter from me later, be useful in the discussion forum. And this can encourage the participants to engage with the discussion forum, of course, and it can also help you later when you're looking for some sort of filter on who gets a reference letter and who doesn't. And this is not such a big deal for small classes, right? You can just, you get to know the students and you can give reference letters that way. But if you're like me and you've taught not hundreds, but thousands of students per year in some years, you need some sort of systematic filter. Otherwise, dealing with the reference letters can be onerous. And what a lot of instructors do is they'll just say no to everyone, or I've even seen it in their signature file, no reference letters, because when you're teaching thousands of students a year. But I think as a compromise, some sort of systematic approach like this can be very helpful. Another technique that's really good for large classes is to create an online booking form. So as students select a time, and this is an example screenshot using Google Forms, and if you're not familiar with Google Forms, there's a link here on how you can set up an online booking form, or you can just contact me and I can give you some tips. So in this screenshot, you can see at the bottom a chance for students to select their time slot, and once a student selects one, it disappears so that the next student visiting the page won't see that. And then Google will arrange for you all the appointment information in an online spreadsheet. And in addition to having booked office hours, you can have the normal drop-in office hours. But again, this is different in online learning. You can record these drop-in office hours and you can post them to MS Stream or wherever you're posting your videos. So what you see here is the bottom of a screenshot of a video. I like to play just a fairly peaceful scene with birds chirping, and then when students enter the office hours, there's not this sort of deafening silence, and they can take their time to compose their question and say hello, and then I turn off the birds and whatnot, and then we talk about the question, and then you can always turn back on the birds when there's a lull, because an hour can be a long time, especially if there aren't that many students, right? So that we all have a chance to sort of relax and think. And then once you've uploaded it, another nice thing about the online learning paradigm is you can create a sort of FAQ, right? You can label at what time points you've got which questions asked, because nobody's really going to go through an hour of recording of an office hours in the hope that their particular questions are being answered, right? But people are used to browsing an FAQ, right? I've got one more tip on how to engage the class outside of the lecture before we get into tips on engaging them in the lecture, and that's to create an anonymous feedback form. So here's an example. Again, it's using Google Forms, so let me know if you need any help setting those up. And it's very simple. At first I asked them, are they talking about the course generally? Is that what this feedback is about? Or are they feeding back on a particular tutorial? And that's really helpful, especially in the first few weeks, to when you're talking to your TAs about making adjustments to tutorial structure and so on. And then there's one main question, which is what is your constructive feedback, right? Okay, and so this allows the more timid students to engage, right? And it's a very useful barometer of what's going on in the course. But just so you're going into this with eyes wide open, know that some instructors at U of T get abusive comments when they set up these anonymous forms. I haven't personally yet, but if you find yourself in that category, there's no shame in reaching out to colleagues for support. Please don't let it stop you from creating this page. It breaks my heart when I hear instructors have tried this kind of form and then felt they had to stop it, because that means that the few students who are causing that fear in them have won. So if there's no questions on this, I'll go into 3 tips on engaging the class during the lecture itself. The first is to play music or fun videos during that transitional 10 minutes that students have between their U of T lectures. And I do mean fun videos. I had to keep resisting the temptation to see this as another learning opportunity, right? To put something instructive in that time. You really keep it unintellectual so that it does feel like a break. Most of the time I just did music. So for example, in week 1, I did some energizing music. And feel free to copy this entire playlist and use some or all of it. Keep in mind, though, that some of the songs I've listed here have inappropriate lyrics. So I only played parts of the songs in that case. So you'll also probably want to reorder this to suit the different moods that you want for different weeks, and expand, maybe add some of your own music. So actually, I recommend you create a repository of more than 13 segments of 10 minutes each with like different moods. And then on the day of the lecture, you could just pluck one out. So for example, week 9, that lecture was delivered just 3 days before an important test. I didn't want to play energizing music. Their anxiety was high. So I played music that was uplifting, but not too stimulating. Next tip is, if you happen to have graduated from a program similar to your students, so maybe you even did engineering at U of T, or maybe you did it at a similar institution, then tell your class what jobs your classmates are doing. So I showed some slides like this one here of my class when we were in first year, and I said, without naming names, where we ended up. I try not to spend too many minutes on these kinds of anecdotes, though. Because you quickly reach a point where the learning suffers. We all know that trade-off between entertainment and inspiration on the one hand and didactic outcomes on the other. So at least one study has shown that if students are fed a lot of anecdotes, they will report that they feel like they're learning more, but they may not be when measured objectively. I think my final tip on engaging the class during lecture is one I'm about to demonstrate. So you'll go into a breakout room in a moment. And I like to have 3 or 4 minutes of breakout room every 20 or 20 something minutes. And the group size of 4 to 5 is something that engineering students are quite familiar with already. And the why is really important. This is a key function that we don't get in classroom settings. When you're in the auditorium, a lot of students are shy about turning to the person next to them. If they're sitting next to their friend, they might just socialize, right? Let alone getting groups of 4 or 5, right? And how do you rearrange all the chairs and then back again in just 3 or 4 minutes, right? So this is something that I really, really like about online teaching, how easy it is to do these. It is controversial, though, because like I was saying about the quality of the breakout room depends on the students in them. So you really need to manage it, right? And this was a point that came up in the chat. Thank you, Anna, about setting expectations about roles and how to participate can help with engagement. So you really have to guide them. I tried to remember this when I could. For example, reminding them to give equal or roughly equal airtime to one another. I talked about the idea of giving roles to them. It depends on the activity you're doing, right? So when you're setting up, and different activities will require different sizes. So when you're setting it up, this is a fairly old screenshot from Zoom, but it can count the participants for you. And then as you slide up or down the number of rooms, it will update at the bottom here how many participants per room. And then you arrived at the number you're looking for. So it's really easy to do that in Zoom. In Zoom, you're given the choice whether you want to keep refreshing or not. And I think I told you before that I do like to keep them the same throughout. And there's a question in the chat, do you have any tips on how to encourage students to participate in those breakout rooms and not have it be an awkward experience for everyone? So I would welcome, anybody here who's listening for further suggestions on that, because maybe I haven't done that topic enough justice. And while you're thinking about how we can encourage more students to engage better in breakout rooms, I see there was another question about the playlist, so I'll answer that before I forget. Did students offer suggestions about the playlists? And yes, they did. And there was a lot of feedback about the music. People suggested certain composers or certain genres as well. And so I was grateful for that kind of advice. And a lot of students were just having fun guessing what the music was, right? Whether they Shazammed it or not. Okay, so now I'd like to turn over to you for this question that came up in the chat. Any further tips on how to encourage students to participate in a breakout room? Anybody want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. I'll venture. So one thing that it goes back to having that structure and setting the expectations. And I noticed that you did this in the example that you gave about the breakout room on the syllabus. So creating that structure of what it is the students are expected to do in the breakout room. I think those are more successful than having just, all right, you're in the breakout room, now discuss. Because it can be hard for some people to get started. But if there are questions to be answered, and if you have, for example, a deliverable at the end, make that explicit and say, okay, we're going to break out for 10 minutes. You know, everyone in the group has their role. And after that, we'll come back to the main room and one of you will share out to the rest of the group. So there is that deliverable as well as the structure of what they had to do, of how, like, the questions they had to answer, or if there was an activity that they needed to complete, maybe it was a problem that they needed to work through and report back on their process or their response. So all of that, I think, can help make the breakout rooms more successful.
Thank you. Yes. So in addition to being very intentional about the structure then and asking for a deliverable at the end, did anybody else have any other ideas before we get into our own breakout room activity? And it really does depend on the activity too. Sometimes it would be a fun game, and it's hard to have a deliverable from a fun game, but sometimes it's a mental health check-in. And more often than not, though, I think for this course, it was some sort of technical exercise that people would work together as a group. But I think the most shining example of a deliverable for this course, because it was a statistics course, is that we were using the breakout room sometimes to create real-world data sets. And then in subsequent lectures, you can analyze those data sets. And then students are looking at the histograms and so on. They kind of see themselves as one small part of that, right? So it's a form of mild engagement on a different plane. Okay, but for now, in your breakout room activity, I do like to number the questions, because that way when you're in your breakout room, you can talk about A versus B, right? Don't just do a spew of bullet points or whatever. The first is quite open-ended. So what are your reactions in general to these slides so far? And I won't be there. So, I mean, I'll try to treat this like a normal class where, you know, you have a chance to talk, giving sort of roughly equal time, maybe 30 seconds or so per person, or if it's going to be 4 minutes. And the second, it's nice to have a more focused question. So that way, if somebody wasn't really listening to me, they can jump in, adding something from your own experience of online teaching. Even if you haven't really listened so far, you can contribute to your breakout group. And as a reminder, this is the URL for those slides.
Thank you.
I also like to copy and paste the instructions into the chat. So I'll just do that now real quick. There. Okay, so if there's no questions, I'm just going to do this 4-minute breakout room. Here we go. Settings. And you'll get a 30-second reminder when the rooms are about to close. All right, we'll see you soon. Okay, so we're all back now. I hope that was useful interaction. And if this were a class, I mean, if it were a very large class, and depending on the activity, it would be a chance to have a discussion now about it. But I think because we're a small group, I'll just invite you to put in the chat anything, any takeaways from that of interest, and I can read them out. But for now, I'm keen to get on to Danny's part of the talk, which is on tutorials. Okay.
Okay.
And of the 7 TAs for the course, 4 were responsible for delivering tutorials. And I gave each of them a default template to follow, but I let them build on it or throw it away altogether. And Danny's going to present his own contribution, which was wildly successful with students. And so I'll hand over to Danny to give his perspectives on online tutorials.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Professor Ebden. Yeah, so a quick intro about myself. I'm actually a master's student. And then my research area is in like integrated circuits for high-speed communication. And then, so I've been the TA for EC 286 since 2016. So I guess I've been here for a while, but yeah. Can you get the next slide, please? Thanks. Yeah, so online classes, it seems pretty interesting, pretty fun at first, but once you like start digging deep, there is quite a lot of challenges that you handle. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, and then I think we can kind of break down the challenges into like two different categories, and they're very similar to the challenges that you would face in a normal classroom setting. So the first challenge will be like to connect with students. So the main thing, right, is Zoom meetings are not very personal, especially when you don't have the camera on, and not everyone likes to have the camera on. So then it's really easy to be like feel disconnected with everyone compared to something that's like in real life, like a classroom setting. And then the second kind of issue is like, it's the same thing as in-person classes in it's hard to encourage feedback from students, right? Because in a lecture setting, the priority is given to the speaker, and it can be really intimidating to kind of interrupt the speaker and ask questions while they're talking. And this kind of extends to Zoom as well. Okay, next slide, please. Right. So what I thought was like, well, like online activities happen a lot all the time. So what can we learn from the internet community? Well, there's a nice streaming platform called Twitch.tv, and it's currently a very, very popular form of online entertainment right now, especially during the pandemic. And kind of how Twitch works is an online personality would stream themselves doing some sort of activity. Usually it starts with gaming, and then it can like transit to other things. And then they would just actively interact with the audience through the chat feature. Usually these streams, popular ones can go up to like 10,000 of viewers or even 100,000 of viewers. So then like it's a lot of like, a lot of online interaction that's even for entertainment, and it's a lot of like very social features going on. Yeah, next slide, please. So then there's like a specific category of Twitch called just chatting, where the host just kind of sits there and chats mainly with their audience in real time. And this is a very broad category. So there's a lot of things that can happen during just chatting session. A lot of it's just like casual conversations. They could be asking audience for advice on things. There's a lot of like studying sessions going on. Some people can play music or like browse the internet together, or just like casual gaming. Okay, yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so then how can we apply these kind of techniques to a tutorial, which our goal is to keep things casual, increase interaction, etc. So this is what I call Twitch streaming tutorials. So there's like 3 goals that I put in here. The first is you want to connect with the audience. And the way that I did in my tutorials was that I was very open about my interests. I was very casual. I don't really talk about stats all the time, especially in the beginning of class. I will actually just talk about what goes on, what happens in a normal just chatting session. I could talk about school. Once I started like talking about Insight professors, talk about careers, such as like what my journey through Insight and what I'm doing now, what my friends are doing now, which is like what Professor Ebden have done as well. And then another things I would talk about anime, I would talk about games, and then I would share memes. So like the meme here, very nerdy statistic memes, is something I shared in class once. And then obviously I want to keep things casual. So during this entire tutorial session, I would just encourage students to use the chat to say anything. Like sometimes I will bring in random topics from like games, and they would just comment on that, even though it's not even related to statistics. And it's just to encourage them to chat, it's not even have to be questions. And I will try my best to respond to chat quickly, even if it's not related, just to like show them that, oh, I see their chat and I'm trying to interact with them as much as possible. And the third thing is just doing activities together with them. So it feels like you're one of them instead of like you're just the teacher in the stage. So then there was one time where I did like a 2-hour session of just like reviewing the final, and there was like a little break, a 10-minute break in the middle, and instead of just like be like, hey guys, let's go on break and like AFK, I streamed this episode of SpongeBob to kind of just watch it together with them, and they really enjoyed that. And in general, it's just doing things together to kind of make tutorials feel personal, interactive. So like doing problems together with them in real time, instead of just like showing them the answer, etc. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah. So essentially, the next topic I want to just kind of get into is like, what can online tutorials really enable? So this is like kind of like the advantage of having an online tutorial setting. So first we have a course concept, and something that we can't really do in real life is using that course concept and apply it to something in real life, so that we can interact with them through live and interactive demos. So this is something I showed them from like a conference that actually uses the central limit theorem to protect noise in a digital signal. And then we can also share like trends into more relatable examples. Here I was showing a ranking plot from League of Legends, a very, very popular online game. And yeah, showing how, you know, even like in a game, in like something that you guys interact with, the central limit theorem can apply. So just these different ways of showing a course concept that you can do online, where you can't really do easily in a classroom setting. Yeah, so next slide, please. Okay, so I guess in summary, so for my tutorial, I just want to keep things casual. And to that, I kind of try to do things in a Twitch stream. So turning that big classroom into like little Twitch studio. And the main goals you focus on is to connect with the audience, keeping things casual and just doing activities together and interacting with the audience. And then of course, there's things we can take advantage of with online learning. You can screen share demos, or you can take some more casual real life, not so serious examples to show course concepts. However, just to like kind of reflect back on this, it's not a perfect solution. It is a solution, maybe. It's just, you know, like it can't always encourage 100% participation. Even on Twitch, not like 100,000 audience is not gonna participate with the online host either. Obviously there are people who are lurking in the background, but hopefully this tip will help. Of course, it's hard to relate to everyone in the class. I definitely got comments where people are like, "Oh, why are you talking about games in stats when like we can't relate to this at all?" But like hopefully these casual conversation can encourage people to be more interactive in general. Yeah, and so yeah, next slide, please. So that's it from me. If there's any like questions you guys have, just feel free to ask. Yeah, thank you.
There's a comment in the chat showing appreciation that you can show the everyday application of stats.
Yeah, for sure.
There'll be another opportunity for questions at the end here. We've got about 5 minutes to the hour, which is enough time to do this very short topic on academic integrity. And usually in online learning, I like to end the lecture at on the hour, like I normally would. And then instead of students coming up to your podium afterwards, I just sort of continue with a question period. So this brief topic, it's also a slightly sad one, but I put it at the end because for many of us, for online learning, this is the note that our courses might end on. According to Pam Kennedy in the Academic Integrity Office, the number of offenses alleged in the academic year we're just finishing was 5 times that of a typical year. So your handling of these offenses might well bleed into the months following the end of your course. In my case, I am still in student meetings. Besides the high volume of cases, to make matters worse, my usual approach to ensuring academic integrity was less effective in the online setting. TAs and I tried several new methods. I'll just mention the ones that work best briefly. The first is to summarize the submissions in a Google spreadsheet. And that can help you rapidly group together the cheaters. And by doing this, you're actually fighting fire with fire, because in the online setting, many students use Google Documents to collaborate during an assessment. And the largest group I know of for this course was about 15 students, but then there were many pairs and triples in addition to that. So to give you an idea of how this works briefly, while people are grading, you ask them to complete an online spreadsheet where you got student as the first column, and we were in CrowdMark, so we had booklet numbers. And then each subsequent column is describing the question in some way. And you can talk to the TA about what would be the best way to characterize each question very briefly. So perhaps for question 1, you're interested in the final line, but for question 2, it's more interesting to mention in just maybe 1 or 2 words at most what kind of approach they were using to question 2. And then you can sort, say, the Q1 column and then followed by Q2 column and so on. to see at a glance where the trends are. And of course, seeing similarity, like between John and Jane Doe, they get very similar results there. That's not enough on its own to call a student in, right? But it is a signal for you to review their papers and see if anything was going on in that case. This method works best if you've got different versions to your assessment. So you can have a question, maybe question 1 had the same wording for all the students who wrote it, but you had several versions, and what differentiated the versions was a tiny little switch in one of the numbers, and that would lead to a different final line answer. So if somebody gets an unexpected final line answer for their version, then that's a signal to investigate, right? So using this, we found somewhere between 8 and 9% of students had cheated on our most recent assessment, which was the exam. And we didn't even do a full spreadsheet. We only did a few questions. If we had done all the questions, I mean, by back of the envelope calculation, I'm sure that the true number of cheaters on that assessment was at least double that, what we caught. But, you know, it's a question of how much effort you want to put in, right? But you will get, even with a simplified approach like this, you will get results that are orders of magnitude higher than the faculty average. However, everything you do to increase the number of cheaters you're catching, of course, creates a second problem, which is how do you, as the instructor, stay sane going to these dozens of student meetings, any one of which might sap your spirit. So my advice is to start with empathy. In my spare time, I was reading the Bruno and Boots series of books, which you may or may not be familiar with. They are set in a fictional school near UTSC. The author published these when he was a teenager. These novels were written by a student for students with a focus on the tension between students breaking rules and the instructors and the administrators. So I found that reading chapter after chapter of these books from the student's perspective on breaking rules did wonders for my well-being because it put me in their shoes. So just to briefly summarize, the talk was in four aspects of online learning. For number 1 and 4, course setup and academic integrity, I mainly talked about the damage control aspects of online learning, but not entirely. And in these middle 2 here, I hope you saw, like for example, Danny presented the Twitch model for tutorials, taking something which a growing number of students are already familiar with and building on that. And for number 2, which was the largest section of this talk, I'd say that moving to online learning opens a lot of doors there. That's the last slide. I wish you all well with your next online class, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Ebden.